Welcome back to Pipeline to Profit, the podcast where we talk about the systems, strategies, and technologies that help companies turn pipeline into measurable revenue. I'm your host, Heather Davis Lam, founder and CEO of renewals. Today, I'm excited to welcome Jason Rieckewald-Schmidt from Salesforce. Jason has spent years helping organizations modernize complex revenue operations. His background spans Commerce Cloud, Revenue Cloud, and helping companies identify something many organizations don't even realize they have: revenue leakage. Most companies spend enormous amounts of time trying to generate more pipeline. But what if the bigger opportunity isn't creating more opportunities? What if it's protecting the revenue you've already earned? Today, we're talking about where companies unknowingly lose revenue after the quote is created, why the quote-to-cash process deserves far more executive attention, and how Revenue Cloud Advanced is changing the future of revenue operations. Jason, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Heather.
Before we dive into this technology, I'd love for our audience to get to know you. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your journey into Salesforce?
Yeah, so Salesforce has the 1-1-1 model where they give it away to nonprofits. So I was a former database administrator working with nonprofits. And so I was doing something completely different. I was working on college campuses. I went to a 5-day admin class, felt like a kindergartner in calculus. I'd never seen a Salesforce page. At that point, they only had one cloud. So that was almost 20 years ago. And then started doing more of that, became a consultant, joined a startup who on my third day becomes Salesforce Commerce Cloud, which was very exciting. Worked at Salesforce for 5 years as a solution engineer and then became a manager. Was part of a RIF in 2023, sold Revenue Cloud and Commerce together as a implementation partner, which was really exciting. And then now I'm back at Salesforce as a Commerce Cloud account executive. However, I only align myself to deals where there's momentum for Revenue Cloud because this idea of revenue leakage is really near and dear to my heart. And so rarely are people excited about e-commerce, but they're very excited about transforming the revenue engines, about capturing lost dollars post-quote. And so that's where I align with our Revenue Cloud teams and excited to help our prospects and customers.
Well, that sounds really amazing. And knowing that you're focused on that revenue leakage and helping those organizations reduce that, what does that look like day to day for you when you're talking to various people?
Yeah, so I think there's, as you mentioned in your intro, there's so much emphasis on pipeline and really on getting into the quote. And so what I'm seeing is there are so many processes and depending on, who you follow, somewhere between 5 to 15% of revenue can be lost with that post quote. And so that can be things like contracts that have to be completely rebuilt. That can be orders that have to be manually rekeyed into an ERP. That's when billing doesn't align with a quote. Renewals, let's say, are completely dependent on sales representatives. I've seen all different kinds of manual processes where they have to compensate for the fact that technology is not having these seamless handoffs. And so where I'm seeing that is anytime a revenue engine is really dependent on human efforts for, let's just call them routine transactions, that's what I'm interested in. And that's where I try to dig in. And so where I'm trying to find is where's an operating model that we can eliminate those unnecessary touches. And that's where, whether you call it Revenue Cloud Advanced or Agentforce Revenue Cloud, the idea of having that revenue engine be an extension of Salesforce's Sales Cloud. And then that's where my product Commerce can kind of scale that. We have to build that revenue engine. We need everything working together. But once you've done that, that's when you can really scale it. And, whether it's growth without headcount or whatever those metrics are, needing to get that unified revenue engine, reducing a lot of those manual touches is where I spend my time, especially in the high-tech space.
Oh, that sounds really exciting. And going along those lines, one thing that you mentioned during our prep conversation really stuck with me, and that you said the companies often lose between 5 and 15% of revenue after the quote's already been created. And to me, that's a pretty eye-opening statistic. So if you really had to talk about revenue leakage in more specificity, what would that be? And can you really define that for our audience?
Yeah. So, it's really a couple things. So one is, where are humans having to intervene where the systems are not talking? So that could be manual approvals instead of automated approvals based on thresholds. I worked with a customer once where we were going from B2C to B2B. So all of their credit card transactions were fine. They built the system for it in the product. Every contract that was based on terms and not paying with a credit card, they had to rekey all of the key contract information into a billing system. So, right, sales is creating these elaborate quotes with all the terms and all the language. But at the end of the day, someone had to manually extract that data and key it in. Now, maybe today that could be done through AI, but it still is a handoff, right, where the data is not flowing seamlessly. And so whether it's revenue is stuck between different systems or different handoffs, finance having to manually reconcile bookings. I see this a lot with renewals and expansions where the data is not accurate. I worked with a very large internet security company last year, and only 2% of their contracts were the same from beginning to end. So, 49 out of 50 times, they're adding new products, they're amending products, they're changing their packaging. All of that was having to be done manually. And they were not using a CRM. They were actually pulling in data from NetSuite, and they were rebuilding all of their contracts, rebuilding that. Now, that was an extreme example, but we see it far too well that there's these high-tech companies who are trying to streamline and automate and AI, but it does not feel like their back-end systems are matching that speed of AI, right? There's just so many manual handoffs, so many missed opportunities. And this is where things like margin erosion, this is where things like unnecessary discounting, high cost to serve come in. And so each one of those manual steps requires a human touch. And, individually, it's more kind of operationally working out, but collectively, right, that's where we're seeing that 5 to 15% because it's compounding. And those are people are hard to replace. And those are, issues that really they're slowing revenue, they're increasing the cost to serve, and ultimately they're hurting margin and operational leverage.
Wow, and that's some really amazing stuff right there that you're bringing up. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't even think about from a day to day perspective. And kind of thinking along those lines, executives often underestimate how much revenue slips through the cracks. And why do you think that is?
I mean, I think because they equate quote or order with revenue, right? And a great way of showing this is, I sell a product called Salesforce Payments. And the way that we show people why they should invest in Salesforce Payments versus another payment provider is we show them, okay, you think you have $100, but really when it goes through all these different things, you're really only getting $94. Well, what if instead of $94, you could be getting $96? And I was on a call today, we're showing someone like, look, just something as simple as a payment provider, that's $200,000 a year. Now, that's not a huge number for some people, that's a rounding error, but that's something that was just completely lost. They had no idea about that. And so that's where we're seeing it for revenue is every one of these handoffs, every time you're delaying cash, that's showing up. Every time you're adding a human into the system. Now, again, the goal isn't to automate the work, but the goal is to eliminate all these unnecessary human efforts. And every time a human has to intervene, every time a human has to overcompensate for a system that's not designed end to end. And so executives think, hey, whatever we got 100 million of revenue, that's 100 million of collected billings. And the answer is it's not, right? There's all of these different leakage places and all of these different handoff places and all these things where there's manual reconciliations or logs or files that create that 5 to 15%. And most of them are astonished when they hear that number. They think it's maybe like 0.5%, right? But we're talking about 10 to 30x that in terms of really what is happening to those dollars. And it's the difference between, what you're selling versus the revenue that you're collecting. And that's really where we're seeing that leakage.
Wow, and that can be a huge difference for many companies out there. And that can make the difference between a new hire, it could make the difference between the ability to buy new technology, or sometimes for some companies even the ability to make payroll. So that's important to keep in mind, right?
Yeah, because it's like, well, if we're going to have to increase, let's say they're like, well, we have to increase sales by 15%. Right? It's like, well, what if we don't have to? What if we can just tighten up and make sure that we're not leaking 8%? Right? So the problem is it puts more pressure on the sales organization, and the sales organization is crushing it, right? They're killing it. They got the quotes. They're doing all the things they're supposed to do. I'm a sales rep. That's my day job. But man, if someone told me my commission was, you're only getting 85% of your commission because we're leaking out all of these things along the way, I would be incredulous. But that's what's happening for these executives, right? All of their budgets and their bonuses and all these things, they're not tied to what they close. It's all tied to profit margin. It's tied to EBITDA and all these other things. And if you can't tighten that up, then you're just leaking money. And that's, I don't call it free money, but it's money that it's much easier to clear that up than it is to find, 10% more customers, right? Or increase every deal by 8%. Like start with that. And now if you're doing it on both ends, right, then that's the real solution. But I don't think people just think of, oh no, we just need a better quoting process, right? It's really our discounting systems, or we don't have the right product mix, or it's the wild, wild west of what sales reps are quoting. And that needs to be shored up for sure. But that back end process of, that it's unsexy, right? People aren't excited about that, right? It's all these other bots and AI and things like that, but it's the unsexy human handoff, right? This is really where people are losing money, and that's a real number, and those are real problems for customers.
100%. And I feel like the process is one part of the solution, right? So you have processes, you have your people, and then you also have your technology, right? And we know that Salesforce has made it very clear that Revenue Cloud Advance is really where they're investing. But many organizations are still running on Salesforce CPQ. And what do you think is driving that shift? And how is Revenue Cloud Advance fundamentally different from Salesforce CPQ?
So what I would say is, I think part of the reason people are with CPQ is it took so long to get it right. And Salesforce is saying, hey, here's the future, and Revenue Cloud is API driven. And where we would see it is we would connect B2B commerce to CPQ for self-service. And let's say, someone wants to buy a subscription. And then, it was relatively straightforward to do that. But when they wanted to amend a subscription, CPQ would make you create the quote just to get the pricing. So we had to do all these levers on the back end so that it wouldn't, because people were like, wait, it takes like 30 seconds for me to get a quote. There's no way that my customers are going to wait 30 seconds to see pricing, And so, what we've seen is the API first is really impressive. And then everything is going headless at Salesforce, right? So that's a big thrust for what we're doing is, we're going to manage that back end, but you can choose what the class is. And so, I think the reluctance is for a couple of reasons. One, they just made such a big investment, right? It was bigger than they thought. I sold a couple of Revenue Cloud implementation deals with commerce over the last couple of years, and they take longer, right? There's just a lot to uncover there. So I think one is kind of that initial investment, and they're like, oh man, we're just getting over the heartache of implementing that. Now we got to turn around and do something new. And I think Salesforce is really trying to think through that progressive, and and the best AEs are thinking about a strategy and multiple levers. But I think one is they just think, man, we just invested so much. But I think what they're missing out is there's a next generation of revenue that's happening here, right? And this is a great opportunity for you to not just rebuild CPQ on better technology, but it's really to rethink your whole processes. It's rethink. So it's not just about replacing one application or just redoing something at the operational level. I think it's the reconnecting of a platform with data, with processes, with customer buying experiences and automation. And I think where I'm seeing customers who are most excited about Revenue Cloud is because they're saying in 2 or 3 years, I really could leverage AI to build a quote, right? I really could leverage all of these other tools. We had a customer last year, they were having huge churn issues with CPQ. And I got rid of their CRO. I want to say I got rid of 25% of their sales reps, and we built them this guided selling platform. Basically, instead of them having to rebuild everything from a quote, we gave them a guided selling, which is kind of like an AI, right? In some regards, but it was a streamline the process, but it was a chance for them to rethink it. And I think most companies are unwilling to rethink their revenue. They feel like we barely just got it set. Now we got to turn around and do it. It's going to, take 6 to 12 months. It's going to be a big investment, and not just to cost, but also time, right? It's going to take RevOps away from, and deal desk and AEs away from what they're selling. But I think the ones who are most excited, they see the potential, and they see that if we can get this new revenue engine going, we're going to be able to allocate all of these AI resources and really help our sellers be more strategic. And so I think the ones who are holding on to it, they're focused on that sunk cost. And I think the ones who are excited and moving on are the ones who either it's a new product or they just realize, it's going to be painful for the next 1 to 2 years. But man, we're going to do circles around people who are stuck in legacy CPQ when we have this API headless revenue engine that we can deploy products in, weeks, not months, and not have all of this technical baggage.
No, that's really fantastic. And one thing that I really appreciate around your perspective is that you're looking just beyond sales for this. You're looking at the entire revenue life cycle and thinking about that, how should executives think about like quote to cash today? And how should they be thinking more about how commerce fits into this conversation?
Yeah. So where I get executives who are excited is usually a CRO who wants to scale without headcount, right? So whether it's, they've acquired a new product or, they're going up market and there's a situation where they're like, it's $1,000 customer, $10,000, it doesn't really matter, but they've drawn a line in the sand and they've said, look, we're not going to serve with these customers anymore, but we need to find a way for them to purchase. And so that's where they're excited about it, right? Or a CTO who's trying to reduce the tech stack, right? And all of the spaghetti and all that kind of like stuff that's together. And then you have a CFO who's like, I care about EBITDA, I care about margin, and things like that. And so you can't really scale unless you have an engine that is connected and you're looking to reduce every single one of these manual handoffs, right? And you're over the years, right? There was a gap and that gap could either be filled in with some kind of one-off app or it could be with spreadsheets and human touches. And so it's really thinking through having a system. And so I think what most people have is they have a quoting system and they ultimately have like a billing platform, but there's just a lot of handoffs around approvals and contracts and amendments and renewal. There's all of these things that are not a system, right? And it would be a process. Or they're always like, what happens if Sally, gets hit by a bus or Sally wins the lottery? Like we're in trouble because Sally's the one who reconciles all of our orders to billing and she's the one who finds the gaps. And so what I'm seeing is it's the rethinking through of the process. And it's the leaders who are thinking 1 to 2 years out and trying to say, okay, right now, let's say, Salesforce can't really have an agent do your entire quoting, right? Or Salesforce couldn't take your existing contract and easily amend it in a way that doesn't involve deal desk or doesn't involve all these approvals. But a day is coming where that's the future, right? And that's going to make reps way more efficient. We always joke about what's the $800 amendment that takes 20 hours, right? Those things are going to go away. They're not going to go away if you're in CPQ. They're only going to go away if you're rethinking your entire life cycle and rethinking not just the coding aspect that's so important for the sales, but all of this leakage and, sewing up all of the holes and plugging them and having a real process. Because a great way to ask a company is, hey, if your sales doubled in the next 6 months, what would break? An enterprise customer's like, well, we wouldn't. But like a small commercial, things like they're like, their wheels start to spin and they're like, oh man, I would have to get, and it's like, okay, that's where clearly you can't scale, right? Your revenue engine is not built to scale. Now, today, quoting is a rep assisted endeavor, right? E-commerce, what I sell it's a scaling endeavor, but the goal is in the future for them to both be scaling, right? They have that engine and whether you're doing 200 orders a month or 2,000 orders a month, the revenue engine can handle that. And that's what we're excited when we're talking to our customers.
Exactly. And thinking about the future, I know that you mentioned this a little bit is AI, right? And thinking about how AI and automation are going to be able to change this process and how you're using these systems, how you're using all of these processes, and how you're creating different things like AI and automation, like that's the future and that's what we're moving towards, right? And it sounds like from what you're saying, setting yourself up for success means making sure you're in the right platform with the right processes and the right people and making sure that you're ready to scale, right? It sounds like you are going to have the ability to grow with the technology, with the new software, with your current team if you're set up appropriately and you're not going to have to go back and rework everything. Does that sound right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I saw it last year when we did that guided selling project because this company only had 50 products, but they had 1,000 legacy products. And so what they did is they created a mapping and they had gone from like a single product to then a suite of products to a platform. Now, that's not every company, but people are always changing their packaging, right? Salesforce is always changing the names, right? Like, right, I always have customers who I'm like, well, this is what you bought. And here's the new names of what we're implementing, right? And you only bought it 3 months ago, right? Something like that. So, but no, it is really about scale. And that's where I get excited. Again, I sell commercial. I have folks who are really trying to scale. They are trying to 3x, 6x, 10x they're not trying to just, improve by 10%. But the reality is, if you do not have a mapping of where things are headed and you cannot do it with your products today, you can't scale, right? You can't 2x, 3x, and so that's what we're seeing is if you can't bring a subscription product to market that is only compatible with certain hardware and make it really easy for one, your reps to quote that, or two, someone to buy it online, you can't bring 10 products to market. That's just the reality. And so it's building that infrastructure, it's building the automation. And then, what AI really promises us is scale. What they're saying is we're going to scale this. It's not rep dependent. It's not dependent on if someone's available or quoting or not on PTO. And the same with e-commerce, right? It's as long as you have a website, you're there. But that's really the goal is we're working towards a scale. And so I think some of it is when folks are more growth minded, they're more willing to stick with older technology and maybe not being on the cutting edge. But the ones who I'm seeing are obsessed with scale, that are obsessed with, hey, if we're going to 3x in the next 5 years, we can't be doing what we're doing. Status quo is not going to work for us because we can't hire that many people. There aren't as many good people that we could 3x in terms of our headcount. So how do we increase our headcount by 20%? But, we 3x our output.
That sounds amazing. And it sounds like you've worked with a lot of organizations over the years that are making these transitions and thinking about how to scale their business. What do you think separates a successful Revenue Cloud project from an unsuccessful one?
It's a great question. The ones that I've seen be more successful, they view it as a corporate initiative around, hey, we're going to build our next generation revenue engine, right? And they don't think about it just as operational. What I would say is the ones that are less successful is when it is treated only at the operation level. This is, let's just make RevOps happy, right? Let's make it easier for deal desk. But what I've seen is when it's tied to something larger like margin or revenue goals or some kind of board initiative, I think that trickles down. Now, there's also other things like, good project manager and, good implementation partner. But what I would say is when this is seen as an operational or revenue ops application, it gets trapped there and it doesn't get the resources and it will just make it work, right? It's just about the quote and we'll figure out the bill. And no, don't deal with finance. They got their own processes. But when it's like, look, we are going to scale revenue over the next 3 to 5 years. We do not have the infrastructure to do this. If we even just increase by 50%, so many things would break. So many things would be more expensive. Our customers would feel that friction. Where I'm seeing it at the C level is when they're having these conversations about growth, about margin, about expansion, and not just about operational friction or issues between, sales is making it hard for deal desk and deal desk is pushing it back on rev, like that kind of inner fighting or inner conflict. Take it up to the C level, make it a corporate initiative. And that's what I try to do with the folks I work with. Like, hey, this is great. We're talking to the head of RevOps. Let's get their pain points. This is great that we're, interviewing people who are at deal desk and, innovate, but how is this tied to a corporate initiative? Because at the end of the day, you're going to get the resourcing and you're going to get the attention you need to drive your revenue engine. There are very few things that are as important as a revenue engine. And I'm shocked when it gets relegated to operational or director level assessments.
Right. Now that makes a lot of sense. And with all of this technology changing so incredibly quickly, there's so many things to think about. Now, in your personal opinion, where do you think revenue operations is headed over the next 3 to 5 years?
I think their goal is to be more strategic and less transactional, right? So I'd imagine a RevOps leader in 2029 is thinking about how do we create guardrails? How do we, manage these bots and manage all of these quoting bots to work out the kinks, right? So I think it's going to be more about strategy and less about, okay, we have this $800 amendment that's breaking and we got all these pricing rules that are firing and all these errors and exception-based handling and things like that. I think it's less about that. I think it's more about, okay, what are the guardrails that we can create and what are the workflows and rules we need to put in place to allow sales reps to have a frictionless or bots to have a frictionless quoting experience. So that would be my take is it's really more taking away from the transactional, let me figure out what this is. Here, I'm going to, turn off this rule in Salesforce so your quote will go through. And I think it's more about designing the system that's going to make it so that quotes can be faster, quotes can be more accurate, approvals need less manual approvals and more thresholds and being able to have levers. I think it would also be about giving reps more visibility into specifically discounting. So for example, hey, if we discount at this level, this is usually what our success rate is. In the near future, discounting is to be tied directly to compensation and commissions. I think we're going to see a switch from, hey, just get the deal done to if there's going to be that much granularity around how much an actual dollar that's one is created at and quoted at. I think we're going to see a lot more scrutiny and the spiffs of the world are just going to take over because if you can get that granular on the data, I think RevOps is going to become more helpful in determining policy around that with the feedback and all of that data. I mean, that's where I see it. I'm not a RevOps director, but I think that's where I see it going because I think the friction and all of the day-to-day stuff is going to get resolved with AI. And so I think it's more about the strategy and it's about making sure that they're reducing friction on all those points where it's a bad sales experience or a bad customer experience.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And while you may not be a RevOps director here, you have a lot of experience and you've seen a lot of systems. You've seen what's worked and what's haven't. And for a lot of companies, that's really valuable information that they don't necessarily get. So I'm really glad that you're here able to share your knowledge with our listeners. And I would love to also give them something that's a little bit practical. So if you're a business leader listening today, like put yourself in the shoes of our listeners, what's one thing you should evaluate in your own quote to cash process this quarter?
So I would say I know there's a lot of metrics out there that people care about. The metric that I am trying to hammer home with my customers is human touches per revenue transaction. So what is the average number of human interactions that is required to complete one revenue transaction? And if you're anywhere near a double digit, you are hemorrhaging revenue because of the handoffs, because of just the manual thing. So I would say, there's lots of other levers. There's lots of other metrics. There's other dashboards. This one is probably, you can't just run it in Salesforce, but you can do an audit in terms of how many things were people touch. So when one of the products we sell at Commerce is order management. And there's a similar correlation that we do for that, which is how many touches does it take from the time an order gets placed to an order gets delivered. And pre-COVID, those numbers sometimes were like 2 or 3. And then post-COVID, when things got way more complex, some were as much as 7 to 10. And so what we saw was that was a huge evaluation tool. And so that same metric I would use to evaluate revenue is just how many people does it touch, right? The quote gets closed one, opportunity gets created. From that point, how many people have to manually touch that and either transform data, validate data, reconcile data. And that would be a good one that tells you. So, I can't tell you what your revenue leakage is. We say 5 to 15%. But if you just did an audit and found out how many human touches per revenue transaction, that gives you a good indication of how much are you able to scale versus how big the problem really is.
And for that audit, do you feel that that's like the most singular investment that you see that consistently pays off for these companies that end up doing the audit? Or is there something else that you can think of that you would say, if I had to spend my money as a leader, this would consistently pay off in bunches for these companies? What would that be?
I would say it's usually the most shocking because I think people always underestimate it. They think, probably like 4, maybe it's like RevOps, Deal Desk, Finance, accounts payable, something like that. What I would say is when we start talking about things like digital transaction shifts or reduction in cost to serve, I would say the most expensive, contribution a company makes is in the people, right? And my hunch is a lot of those manual workarounds could be replaced with a better system, with automation, and then retrain those people to do something that's way more interesting, way more strategic, and way more helpful to the bottom line. So I think you could do lots of different things, right? What I would say is if you just trace, and most companies have never done it, just trace an order that comes in, right? Quote gets created, close one opportunity, just trace it and see how many people there are. And then again, I don't think you need to replace everything at once, but it starts to show, okay, wow, we really are leaking things. And if we did increase by 20%, this would be a problem, right? And why is it that we have to manually do things into the ERP? If there's APIs and there's all this technology, right? And data is synced, why are we running these batch processes? Or why is the format incorrect? Or why is someone manually validating that something came in back in Salesforce? Shouldn't they just be looking at an exception report? Like there's all of these things that is fodder. But I would start with there because that's where you would say, okay, this is a major problem because they're going to say, oh, it's a billing problem. We need a new billing solution, or, oh, our quoting's antiquated, or, it takes too long. How can we reduce time to quote? But I would say all of these things get pretty much their attention that they're needed, or there's reps who are driving that. Rarely are people thinking about the entire system and thinking about, and so I would just say, like, just get out a piece of paper and every time you touch someone, put a little hash mark, right? And then once you start doing the diagonal hash marks after, you're like, wow, this really is way more involved. And again, no one designed the system to be like this. This system just evolved. So, right, it evolved with new products, and it's like, oh, it was different when we did physical goods, but now we do digital goods, right? We had to account for that because we had a legacy ERP. Like, no one's designing these systems. And so that's where that's a good metric to try to figure out how far have we, gone away from what we think it is. And then, then figure out what's the priority. And that's where, a good partner or Salesforce can help you figure out how can we help prioritize those things. We know you've made a huge investment in CPQ, right? We know that it's, it's going to be a huge investment to move off of that. But when you start seeing all these touch points and you start seeing that you can't really scale, and at some point this is hurting revenue, it's going to hurt revenue, regardless of how many orders you're bringing in. That's where it's really telling, and that's where we get executives' attention.
No, that's a lot of great points right there. And I really feel like this has been a fantastic discussion. And one of the biggest takeaways that I get is that companies often focus all of their energy on creating more pipeline, when sometimes the fastest path to growth is actually protecting the revenue that's already flowing through the business. So, modern revenue operations isn't just about selling more, it's about building systems that help organizations capture every dollar they've already earned. So, for our listeners who want to continue learning, where can they connect with you? And are there any Salesforce resources you'd recommend that they explore?
Yeah, I mean, Salesforce is continually putting out webinars around Revenue Cloud. And I would say I've been with Salesforce since 2018. This is the most I have seen a collaboration between Revenue Cloud and commerce. So that's really exciting. Part of the reason I came back is I was, seeing this partnership that was really growing around that. And then I'm just seeing it with, in the market. So I would say Salesforce is a great resource for that. Lots of webinars, success stories. People can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm publishing 5 times a week, really around the idea of touchless revenue. So kind of taking that idea of revenue leakage, which is great because it's about Revenue Cloud and commerce. At the end of the day, I'm only comped on commerce. So I'm a little more incentivized to talk about that. But it's almost impossible for me to have a successful customer who's not thinking about the bigger picture. And so, yeah, we'd love to connect with people. But yeah, I'm publishing stuff 5 times a week, and Salesforce has incredible resources, and they would love to chat with prospects who are considering, hey, maybe we are leaking more than we thought. I think it's really easy to say, it's much easier to hire a sales rep, right? We're going to add one more rep, right? It's an easier fix than it is to reconsider our entire end-to-end quote to, cash, quote to order process. But I think, folks are so focused on margin and EBITDA and reducing cost to serve. And I think it's an untapped area. And it's one that Salesforce has been, servicing for over a decade. And so as we're moving to this next gen of AI, man, I can feel it's coming. And the winners are going to be the ones who had the forethought to think through our systems and how do we scale? Because I do feel like a scaling event is going to be happening here. And CPQ, while it is a great product, is a legacy package. It's a decade old and is not designed to scale your revenue in the same way. So.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for that. And thank you for joining us today and sharing your perspective on one of the most important conversations happening in revenue operations today.
Well, thanks
And
for coming.
thank you. Now, this has been fantastic, and you've brought a lot of great points, and you've also given some great advice to our listeners, and I'm really hoping that they're able to take that to heart and bring that back to their companies. And thank you all to our listeners as well. Thank you to everyone listening to Pipeline to Profit. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and share this episode with someone who's thinking about the future of revenue operations. We'll also put in the descriptions all of these links that Jason was talking about so that you can easily go and check out some of those Salesforce resources as well as the LinkedIn posts that he was mentioning. Until next time, keep building stronger systems, smarter processes, and more profitable growth.